What else?
Sorry, I forgot to start the recording. I get a newbie in here. He just can't follow the process.
What else happens if you don't get them and keep them convinced that you have PI and it needs to be done in a rigorous way?
Forward progress is going to get stalled or reversed.
Tell me more about what you mean by stalled, Anthony.
Well, you've got a new procedure with the new PI. You're getting people to buy in, and then you're not going to keep people involved. So you've got a new procedure, and like you said, where are they going to go back to? They go back to the old procedure, and all of that shifting in the thought process, the machinery for shifting from one process to another, that's not free and that's not zero either. It certainly isn't productive stuff to get the project moving forward. So that's what I mean by stall. It's going to be stalled or it's going to go backwards at that point.
Got it. Thank you. So show of hands in the chat. Do you all agree with what we've been talking about, that this is a problem and that you need to get and keep them convinced, get people both on the team and management elsewhere convinced of the importance of doing PI rigorously? If you agree, give me a thumbs up or something like that.
Yeah, a bunch of people in the chat too.
Yep. All right. Since we agree, which I'm glad to see, how do we do that? And that ultimately comes down to, you need to understand that people don't understand how PI works. How do I know that? Well, I've been doing this a long time, but I also know that most people don't understand things that they're not really in the weeds with. They don't get it. They don't really understand what, yeah, exactly. You need to know the destination to get there. They need to understand how you do this stuff and why it's important and what the value of it is. And there's a tool in place that most projects are now trying to start to use, probably for the last decade now, called organizational change management, or OCM. And I want to talk about that somewhat today, because I think that's the key part of making sure you tell people what they need to know, and that you help them understand the value of why you're doing it, so that they actually will sit back and say, wait a minute, why are we skipping that first step? Why aren't we writing down the original process that we're trying to change? So we know when we've changed it, if it actually changed, and if it made any good sense to do that, or if we made a mistake. So with that, and I'm really cutting this really kind of short, but because of the new changes, I'm doing my best. So the first thing I want to talk about here is the formula for change. And it starts like this. It says the dissatisfaction with the current state, the perception of that, and multiply that times the vision for what the possibility for the change could be, which is kind of nebulous, I understand, but trust me on this one. And then what's the first easy step that you can take, or steps you can take toward achieving that vision? All of those things multiplied together need to overcome the resistance for change, or resistance toward the change. If you think about it this way, what you're winding up with is a situation where you can start to say, okay, what does it mean to be dissatisfied with the current change? Let's assume you were back at that software project that I talked about before. What's the dissatisfaction in that state, in that project? Well, the dissatisfaction that caused them to need to do this was, it was an extremely manual and extremely slow process that needed to be improved in speed and accuracy so that they could, I don't know, make money, because they found that they were losing money regularly on almost every transaction. And fundamentally, that's not a good thing for the consumer of the healthcare or for the insurance company. So they said, how do we do that better? And their vision was, let's go about automating a lot of those processes involved, that process set involved. And to do that, they needed to find a vendor or create it internally, but they chose a vendor approach who provides that automation software to help that happen. And then what are the first and easy concrete steps? Well, they contracted with that vendor. They tried to make the processes work better based on what the vendor was telling them, and asked the vendor to try to adapt to the customers, our consumers' software. And that's where things really started to break down. They were able to generate the dissatisfaction piece, make people understand why this was an important thing to do. They were able to establish a basic vision for what was possible after the change, that it would require a whole lot less manual work, a whole lot fewer mistakes, just a whole lot less overtime, all the other pains that went with this to make more money for the company.
Well, how do
But
they figure out though that if you're dissatisfied, this takes a long time? How do you make sure that your original problem doesn't come back, that the process had been developed to go through and do? Because we had that happen where they got rid of the process. We don't like it. It takes too long. Everybody hates it. In the next release, everything fell apart. So
I'm not surprised by that. Jim, I've seen the same thing before. In this case, though, they had the benefit of pretty much everybody felt the process was not wrong in and of itself. The basic processes were there and they were functioning in a way. It just was too manual and too error prone because of the manual aspect of things. So if I'm hearing what you're saying right, in the case I'm describing, it wasn't hard to get to that to make people feel that dissatisfaction because they were already there. In the case of what you're talking about in general, I think again, it comes down to writing out the process, making sure that people all agree to what the current process is
yep, and what the reasons for it are.
and what the reasons for why you're doing that process are. Absolutely. Which, when you're trying to convince people of the value of PI, and the need to stop and write down the current process, there you go. There's a real big piece right there. What I also find is that people move toward, in the sense of what you're saying, Jim, people move easily toward well, this is a real pain. I really don't like the way it is. What's the vision for how it's going to be after the change? Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. We're going to love that. And they skip over the how do you get there? You got to bring them toward that. What are the steps we need to take to do that? And you start with, here are the first ones. They're easy, they're concrete, you can make them happen, but they are not all you have to do. You just need to be careful how you sell it so that people don't feel like the resistance goes up even more because, oh, it's hard. I don't want to do it if it's difficult. The other thing to say about this is, you look at the ADCAR model, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and the last thing is reinforcement. You need to continue to reinforce things. ADCAR is not the change, OCM change is not a one and done thing where you increase the awareness, you increase the desire, you give people knowledge, you give them the ability to make sure that things happen, and then it's done. You need to keep running this cycle over and over and over again. So let me talk about ADCAR. There are lots of various models for OCM out there. If you do a quick Google search, you're going to probably find a half a dozen or more. ADCAR is one of the more common, generally one of the more accepted ones. Most of them break down to basically this stuff. They just slice it up the same or a different way for each model. Jim, did I start to address what your question was or what your point was?
Yep.
Okay, so when you get to something like ADCAR, just as we're talking about, you need to give them awareness. Why do we need to change? And in the case of the project I talked about, the awareness was already there. These people, the audit people, were working inordinate amounts of hours, just an enormous amount of hours for the number of people that they had on the team. The organization, the leadership of the organization thought we're killing our people and we're making them do too much work. And boy, all of them, management and people, thought this is too error prone just because of the manual nature of it. We can't keep track of what's happening as easily as we need to. We can't manage the flow as well as we need to. We got to change. So the desire already started in that case from the point of people already had kind of a desire. It wasn't hard to sell them on making this change, buying that software, getting it to work right with their process. What do you do when the case is that, as you implied, Jim, people don't necessarily have that desire? And Anthony also. What do you do when they don't necessarily have that? How do you build that desire in people?
That's where the vision comes in. I think where you have to communicate to them, what's this new process going to look like, and how is it going to be a benefit to them and to the organization.
Totally agree, Jesse. I will add to that I think you need in most cases to do that in more than just a hand waving, yay, rah, rah kind of way.
Oh, absolutely.
You need to show them data, even if it's forecast level data, that tells them here's really what's going to happen.
That's the first easy win, is a big step in that.
Yep.
If you have a first big failure, you're not going to get anywhere.
No. No, that generally doesn't work so well if you say, hey, this is going to be great. Look at that. Yeah, this Hindenburg thing, this Zeppelin thing, that's going to be awesome. And then it crashes. That's not a good thing.
There's a question in the chat, Tim, if you get a chance.
I'm looking now and I'm trying to understand what you're asking, Gary.
Thank you. I understand that ADCAR is a labor-intensive process, and obviously, we would like more to happen there. But the question is, are there other systems out there, other stories that may be more risky, which is why they're not tried, but where there's been better success? This has been a long-standing problem with most software projects. That's my question. I don't know if I explained it well.
Yeah, I'll agree with what Gene says. The PDM process, stage gating, agile in general, if you're familiar with that, which takes things apart and does them in a not all out, but small pieces at a time kind of way, will help what I think you're talking about. I think. Did that hit toward what you're talking about, Gary?
Yeah, I appreciate the list. I got Agile, but what were the other two that you mentioned, Tim?
Oh, the stage gate and the PDM process that Gene talked about in the chat. All of which kind of go toward that same break it apart. Don't try to bite it all off at one time. Bite take the elephant in bites rather than all at one bite.
Thank you, Tim.
Sure. PDM also, Gene, feel free to jump in on this too, but stage gate and PDM let you make sure that you're doing things right along the way, not wait for the end. So not only and you're doing this like in an agile way where you're trying to do it in pieces over time, you're also making sure that the pieces you're doing are producing the results you're hoping for. And that you're making the progress you need to be able to move to the next step. Has anybody here used OCM before? Whether it's ADCAR or some other version of it?
We did a huge project related to that for a mid-sized company in New Jersey where they were changing it was an insurance company where everything was human touch. And when they decided, because everything was moving to the web, and they decided, well, they needed to do the same thing, and they looked at it from an organizational change management perspective, and put a lot of effort into making that work successfully. And one of their goals was they had been around over 100 years and they'd never laid off one person, and they wanted to retain that goal through this whole change. But yeah, they put a lot of effort into it and taught change management and a process. And so, yeah, I have some experience with that.
Thanks, Jesse. One thing for those of you who haven't dealt with OCM before will find, if you try to use it or your organization tries to use it, is that projects in the past have tended to be, let's make this happen, let's do it, let's produce a thing and hope that everybody accepts it in the end and adopts the new thing. What OCM works toward is saying, hey, people don't just change and adopt stuff on the fly just because there's a new, better mousetrap. People need to be given the instruction, the help, the guidance, the tooling, all of that sort of thing to be able to get them to adopt it and really take it to heart rather than just intellectually they adopt it, viscerally in their hearts. That's what OCM is really about. And honestly, I think OCM and process improvement really kind of go hand in hand, because if you produce a new thing and nobody uses it, it isn't going to be a great thing for anybody. You spend a lot of money and time and effort and heartache to make something happen and nobody actually adopts it and uses it. What's the point? A good friend of mine taught me a long time ago that hope is not a management principle. And the way we used to do projects before OCM was hope is a management principle, and that was never true. It just sounded great. So we've talked about awareness and desire. So knowledge on how to change. Well, that sounds kind of dorky, doesn't it, to you? It sure does to me. How do you change? What do you need to know about to change? You change, right? Or not right?
Not right.
So what does knowledge on how to change look like? Anyone?
This is Dick. You need data. You need data to begin to measure what's not working and how you measure it, how you want it to improve.
Very important, extremely important, Dick. Awesome input.
Because if you don't have data to back up your arguments, either with the resistors or management or whoever may not want to make the change, sometimes this falls on hard times.
Yeah. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it, right?
And especially organizations or projects, probably a better way to say it, that don't like measurement or people don't like to be measured, don't like measurement, it becomes a problem. To making any improvement.
I totally agree. So what else about knowledge is important? Knowledge of how to change. When you've had to make a change other than data, what did you use to help you make that change? When you needed to buy a new car, for instance, or a new house, or anything in general, you need to make a change to be able to adapt to the new thing, which does things in slightly different ways than you're used to. How did you make that change? Literally, how did you go about making that change? Part of it is collecting data, no doubt. What else?
Well, you got to have the motivation.
Agreed. And if you're scared of making that change, how motivated are you?
None.
Yeah, exactly. If your managers came to you and said, you're going to make this change, how excited are you to make that change? Not very. You have to do something that is often called crossing the chasm. You've got yourself on one peak on one side, and you're trying to get to the peak on the other side, which is higher and better than the one you're on. And you've got to cross the chasm in between, the valley in between. And that's not an easy thing for people to do. So yeah, you need to look at the pros and cons of the options, and you need to look at them with data, and you need to look at them with personal emotion involved as well. Get over those fears, some of which can be handled by data, some of which can be handled by support groups and things like that. Individual mentorship, all of those kinds of things. You've got to know the ways that change happens best, so that you can help people understand how to help them over those hurdles and fears. And then you need to go ahead, sorry.
Doesn't that need to be stated explicitly by management that we are there to help you deal with the various things that causes you to be fearful of the change? In my many years, I've rarely heard that said.
Gary, you just touched on ability. Thanks for the segment.
Sorry about that.
No, that's perfect. I'm glad you did that. Thank you. Not only are you giving them the tools and skills and that sort of thing, you've got to give them that safe space, that impetus of, if you try this, it's not going to be a bad thing. If we try this and fail, it isn't the end of the world. We don't want that to happen, says management, but we're here to support you. We're here to give you what you need to make that change, rather than just make the change or else. And yes, Gary, I've rarely heard that management does that very well, if at all. I've seen it a few times, but it's not rare. It's not common. Go ahead, Gary. Sorry.
One of the things that I've seen over time is a new mousetrap comes out, a new, better, whatever it is, and we have to go from the current peak across the chasm to the new peak, and that's scary. And there's really the expectation is the first time you do the new thing, you will be at least as good as you were on the old thing.
Yep.
Because we're going to be and that's going to be a setup for failure right there. Because I mean the learning curve, is assumed to be zero, and that's a wrong move there. I've seen that more than once. That well, you were doing good on the old one. Why can't you do good on the new one? Because I don't know the new one.
Right.
That's like asking kids to drive a car with a clutch.
Right.
You're going to burn out clutches, and shop's going to be happy, and
Yeah, you can drive an automatic transmission. Why can't you drive a car with a clutch? Come on.
Yes, exactly.
Not that hard. Still driving a car.
And truly, it isn't that hard. But you don't want to burn out the clutch to do that, because that's expensive.
Yeah. Or bark the tires every time you press or let the clutch out, because that's expensive too.
Yeah. Starting out learning in Duluth is probably not a good choice either, but
probably not. No. All that comes down to the ability stuff. You've got to be able to give people the tools they need to be able to use that new process. You've got to give them the training they need to be able to do that new process or use the new process. And you've got to give them training more than just, in most cases, more than just, hey, okay, this is a paper-based training. I'm going to show you what buttons you can push and what they do and all that kind of stuff. You need to give them practice time. When I've seen this work well from the ability standpoint, the training piece comes down to there's a sandbox. People can go and play in that sandbox, try different things without actually impacting things in production to see what happens. If I do this button or I do this step or whatever, does that break something? Is that what I was supposed to do? All that sort of stuff. You've got to give them that sandbox availability. That's just one of the key tools. And you need to give them somebody who's going to be able to sit alongside them, who knows how the new process is to be applied within the new tool set, so that they can coach the people doing things in the sandbox Otherwise, it's just playing around and seeing if I punch this button, do I blow the thing up or not? And you don't want that either. And then finally is the reinforcement part. You know, again, you don't go through this whole add car process and then go back and cycle around again, and then go back and cycle around again. You're actually doing the reinforcement piece along the way. As soon as you're doing awareness and desire, you better start hammering on awareness and desire before you really, or while you're doing knowledge, I should say. And then when you're doing ability, you should be doing ADK again. You know, and how do you do that reinforcement? What are some of the best ways to do that reinforcement part, do you think? While you're thinking, by the way, I'm not giving you anything that you're going to be certified in OCM on. I'm trying to give you an idea of how this stuff works.
Isn't one way to give people examples of prior success?
Give me a little more on that, Gary.
Well, there's a guy by the name of Collins who wrote a book called Rethinking Expertise. What he talked about was the Atacama telescope. And there they had 6 or 10 different types of experts, mathematicians, mechanical engineers, astronomers, meteorologists, and no one could understand or talk to anyone else. This was a problem because they all had to work together. They were trying to do impossible things, getting a 30-foot span of mirror to be within a tenth of a wavelength of light in terms of the optics. So they brought in a sociologist who was technical, and he was the negotiator and the diplomat. And that's just one idea. But to me, often I have found in my experience to give people examples outside the domain where they're not going to be afraid of talking about something within the company, which could step on toes, but talk about something else, they would be freer to talk. Change agents can appear if they're inspired. That's my view.
That makes sense, Gary. So ultimately, yeah, you're giving people a safe psychological space where they can express themselves without feeling a fear of being trampled on or down, put down or anything like that. As well as giving them the tools to be able to have those conversations. And
yes,
examples of how they work. Go ahead, sorry.
The examples would often be filled with anecdotes that would allow them to speak indirectly, if you will. Right. And that helps. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say.
Nope, I think that's great. Thank you.
I think part of reinforcement is the ability to, show progress and the benefits and the data, the improvement that you're seeing from that progress, and being able to feed that back. That can help with that reinforcement piece.
Also great. You're absolutely right. If you're not giving them data about how things are proceeding, then you're basically just yay rah-rahing, cheerleading to them. And people anymore, at least, don't really believe a lot of that stuff. Show them the successes you're building on.
Yeah, as part of this could be, is it potentially setting some milestones and then celebrating those milestones? Is that part of reinforcement?
Bingo. I mean, which goes to what Gary talked about before with stage gate and PDM. I mean, you want to build those milestones. You want to build those stopping points where you can do things like even celebrate successes. So if you're familiar with project management, you probably, like I do, see how the two things, project management and OCM, sort of are complementary to each other. The other thing I'll say about reinforcement kind of goes along the lines of, or goes applicable to every one of the ADKA steps as well. It's a ton of communication. You have to figure out who to communicate with, who are the stakeholders that need to know this stuff, who needs to be aware, who has to have desire, who needs to have the knowledge on how to change, who has to be given the ability, the skills and behaviors, etc., to change. And in order to do that, because the message is not the same for everybody, you need to identify who the stakeholders are, who's affected by the project, who is, or by the change, who is going to impact the change. And to that end, the message also changes over time because you're focusing a little less on awareness as you go along. You're focusing a little less on desire as you go along. You're focusing more on knowledge, more on ability. You've got to be able to adjust that messaging along the way. In your communication, you need to adjust to fit to who needs it, when they need it, what they need. So what else do you want to know about OCM? And how it affects being able to get people to understand what PI does, or process improvement is like, and how it works, as well as the value it brings to the table. Because it does, this ADCAR thing, this OCM thing doesn't have to specifically apply to a project. It can apply to a concept as well.
What's the most difficult part of this to get people to understand it, the leaders to, yeah, you've talked very positively. I'm asking to look at a, without tearing it all to pieces, what is the negative? What are the gotchas? What things should we be aware of when we're looking at this, or when we're doing this, so we, so at least we're aware of the booby trap before it gets us all snagged up. That makes
Understood.
sense?
It does. Thank you. Understood. The biggest gotcha I find in use of OCM is trying to really validate where people are. I talked about you're going to have different stakeholders that need to have a different level of awareness and desire potentially. Somebody who is going to be using the new process probably needs a little more awareness and desire than somebody who is impacted by the process downstream, as an example. And you need to be able to tell for those different sets of stakeholders how much buy-in they've got. You've got to be able to say, well, the main body of people who are going to use the process, they seem like they have desire to do this new thing, but I'm not too sure. So how do I find that out? Bottom line, Anthony, is the key is trying to figure out the main roadblock here. The potential roadblock is trying to get a sense of each of the stakeholder types, and theoretically even each of the individuals involved. How much buy-in have they given? Are they aware for sure? How do we know? Do they have desire for sure? How do we know? Do they have the knowledge they need? How do we know? That's the hardest part about OCM in my book.
Thank you. It's when I make presentations. When I make presentations to a development team, it's different than when I make a presentation to line management, and it's much different than presentations that I make to executive role.
Bingo, absolutely. And then once you've given that information to them, did they really take it in, or did they just say, yeah, sure, that sounds great, thanks, I appreciate that? How do you know that? How, in your experience, how do you know how much people have bought off on what you're trying to sell them or make them change to?
That's where the rubber meets the road. You've got to document, take notes on, who's helping, who's doing, and some of these things are kind of nebulous. How is executive role helping you? How are they standing in your way? Did they just sit there and say, yeah, and get out of here? I've just wasted half an hour of your presentation time. You've wasted half an hour of my time on your presentation. That's difficult to say because they're very good at keeping a straight face and all of that. But if they come around and it's time to discuss, what are we doing in the the PI work that we're doing. And if all they're saying is faster, faster, all this stuff is getting in the way, they didn't buy in, and you're going to have to do something. I mean, in fact, at that point, the train is probably off the tracks or very nearly off the tracks.
Yeah, even before it started much.
Yeah. And I mean, it does happen that way.
It does, no doubt. So how do you figure that out? Anyone, not just Anthony, but how do you figure out whether people are on board with you or they're putting the proverbial penny on the rails that's going to take the train off the tracks?
I always said, just walk around and look at the Dilbert cartoons that are posted on the cubicles, and they'll tell you exactly what their feelings are on things like this. Yeah, I mean, you have to talk to people and get their feedback, and there's no easy way to get that information. You just have to go and get it.
Correct. I think
I second the motion on the Dilbert cartoon.
Yeah.
I got to tell you, I've been in situations as a consultant where the Dilbert cartoons are plentiful, but we still made things work when we made changes, simply because we've done things the right way. We've given people the ability to trust us, whereas they may not trust their typical management or typical situation.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There's no question that that's a big part of it. And they do not trust what comes out of management's mouth, because there's a reason why. It's been a history of not being able to trust them, and so when it comes from someone outside the organization, it does increase your odds.
That helps, yes. But you definitely hit the nail on the head, Jesse, in terms of you got to talk to people. You may not be able to talk to everybody, but somebody needs to talk to as many people as they can. All the
Exactly.
stakeholders.
Yeah.
Which is why, even though OCM is done by the PM and other people, it's a group effort. There's often in today's world, at least in projects, there's often a person whose job it is to plan and manage a lot of the OCM work. But even that is that's that person's job and nobody else has to do it. The OCM person needs to be able to say, here's the plan. PM, I need you to go ask these people these sets of questions. And here, architect, I need you to go ask those people these sets of questions. And whoever else, let's gather that data. The second part of it is you need, again, to build that trust. And how do you build the trust? Show successes, show data. Here's where we thought we were supposed to be, and here's where we actually are at this point in this change. It goes a long way to building that trust if it's data driven.
Yeah.
And once you get and keep that trust, all the Dilbert cartoons in the office don't really make much difference in that small sphere. That small narrow area, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, just being able to show the progress and show that people are focused on this and that they're accomplishing things, just making sure that that's visible to the people in the organization.
Right.
This is Dick. How do you make organizational change and process improvement? How do you build it into the culture of the organization?
Awesome question. The short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is you've got to be able to have people who are willing to and knowledgeable enough about OCM and experienced enough in OCM start to talk with the management of the organization in question and get them to realize that they themselves are sometimes impediments and that you need to do these sorts of things in order to build that trust. And that part of the steps that you need to take to get there is figuring out, before we make a change, let's figure out how things are working now. What's the process? What's broken about it? Be able to build that dissatisfaction. That's a really simplified answer to a long, long answer. But it comes down to you've got to work outside of any one project or one change effort to get leadership to understand that they are the ones who drive the culture, and leadership needs to change and adapt to an OCM driven situation to be able to make it work. I don't know. Did that answer your question, Dick?
Yeah, I agree. It all starts with expectations from the top.
Yep. Culture flows from the top.
Yeah, that was $1 million question, Dick. When you asked that question, I was thinking, wow. If we could solve that one, we'd be all millionaires.
I was just gonna say, if I could solve that, I wouldn't be here. I'd be retired too. Because I'd have made $1 million already just last week.
Yeah,
Um,
Well,
you know, that-
Unless you've worked in an organization that has a cultural process improvement, you really have a trouble making the case this stuff works.
Agreed. I can tell you one of the places that I've worked in the last decade or so, talked a lot of good game about process improvement. They actually had 2 people that they hired to be process improvement documentation people, and they had given that over to a mid-level manager to make it happen. So they did all the right things, but in the end, it came down to, no, it's too slow. We can't do that. It's too painful. We can't do that. It takes too much money. We can't do that. So yeah, I mean, unless you're part of an organization that understands this and buys into it, people can talk a good game or not even talk that at all, and it's going nowhere. Hope that made some sense.
Oh,
Your audience has to want to believe before it will believe.
Correct.
It's very difficult to give a Euclidean proof of this stuff.
Correct.
yeah, that's where that vision part comes in again. And the other thought that I was just thinking of too is that, this is something that would be a lot easier for a smaller organization, a growing organization. But you talk about, how would you do this in a 3M or Medtronic? And it's probably impossible. It would have to be done at a much lower level.
That's an interesting case, Jesse. My experience tells me that you're sort of right. Not that my experience is the end all be all, but I find that OCM is more regularly adopted in larger organizations than small ones. A small startup, for instance, doesn't have time for this. That's the inevitable result, or the inevitable feeling on the part of leadership. We don't have time for this. We got to move. We can't sit and talk to, hold hands and sing kumbaya. We got to move.
Yeah, yeah,
That-
but what I was saying is that, so let's say that one of the movements is, hey, we can't continue to do it this way, we gotta do it this way. So, yeah,
Now, that said, Jesse, I think that what I've seen, in fact, I know what I've seen is mid-sized organizations, 250, 300 kind of people,
mhm,
adopt this fairly readily because of
Yeah.
what you just alluded to. They
Yeah.
see that we can't just wing it, and we can't just keep doing what we've always done, because that doesn't always work. We've got to change, and we better not make a mistake. We don't have the wherewithal to make a mistake. So the best way not to make a mistake is to go through a process like OCM to make sure that everybody's on board, that nobody's going to revert once they've done the change, all those kinds of things.
yeah,
And inside a big organization, one of the reasons that I find that large organizations like a 3M or a Rockwell in my case, or larger things, health partners, whatever, the reason that they adopt this is because it is adopted and done at mid-level parts of the organization first, and the leaders begin to see the successes, and then they adopt and sort of prescribe this for everybody.
exactly, yeah,
Culture can also flow from the top of the middle, I guess, in this case. My original intent was to have people break out into 3 and 4 groups to apply this to a specific project that you all might figure out. I'm thinking that's probably not going to work all that well here right now, but I'm willing to try it if you want. Here right now being everybody all of one big group.
Let's give it a shot.
Okay. What project would you think might be a good one to try this on? And I want you to pick something from your own experience. And it should be, to make it simpler, it should be PI specific, not PI as part of something else.
Stick again. One of the things that helps process improvement, depending on your organization and what you're aware of doing, what you're doing, is fear. So I spent 31 years at IBM Rochester here out in the cornfields, and we always had the fear that if we didn't do this stuff, the guys in Poughkeepsie would take over.
Yep.
And you certainly didn't want that to happen.
No, you don't want the guys from Poughkeepsie to come into the big group. The Rochester playing.
Because we won all sorts of quality awards and we made money. The bottom line is we made money. We were very profitable to IBM.
Well, yeah, AS400 lasted a long time.
Yep. And before that, the System 38, 34, 36, 32. That whole line of mid-range systems did really well. And so if you're making a lot, if you got that, it helps to be successful and to get the idea into everybody that we have to have this culture of quality that really went way back to the early mid-range or first systems that Rochester put together, because the customer was expected to buy this system, install it, and it would run. They don't have any system programmers and all those sorts of guys to keep it going. We expect the system to work.
Yep. I'm about to start an engagement a consulting engagement that they basically said that to me. We don't have time to make a mistake, so do it the right way. Customers are paying good money for this stuff. We don't have time to make a mistake for them.
But man, we got forever to clean up the mess.
Yeah, but Anthony, then I go back to the old saying of business would be so much easier if it weren't for customers, because after we have every day or all the time in the world to clean up the mess, we don't have customers though.
No.
So again, if you want to try this, to try to apply OCM kind of thinking toward a specific project, we need to have a specific project to try. And somebody needs to be able to describe that to everybody.
I can't remember the exact quote, but Watts Humphrey, famous IBM software guy, says we can always fix it after it ships.
Yeah, I've heard that way too many times in most of the companies I've been in. The most famous of them is I used to work for a company called Tel Labs that produced huge trunk switches, telephony switches for between big cities. And, they would often joke that we could fix it after it shipped. And then they all realized that that didn't work so well because you couldn't really shut the switch down. And it usually took shutting the switch down to make the fix. Okay, since we're not able to figure out a project though, do you want to ask more questions? I want to talk about more.
Well, it's an interesting concept. I mean, if you go back to your original slide, Tim, and you asked, how much of a project is process improvement, and very little, if any, is process improvement. And so what you're saying is that if we were able to get process improvement built into the projects themselves, it's not going to be successful if we don't also include OCM.
It'll be less likely to be successful, Jesse. I don't know that I would say that it won't be. It just will be less likely, in my opinion.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess it would be dependent on what you're improving, right?
Right.
Yeah. And whether it's a significant improvement or whether it's just a minor improvement. Yeah.
Right. You know,
Yeah.
all that said, I can also tell you that I've never been in my 30 years of project management. I've never led or been part of a project that didn't involve some level of process improvement. Because you don't generally implement a piece of software or something like that unless there's a process that's being changed, whether that's change from nothing to a new process or change from existing to an improved process.
Mhm. Yeah.
You know, you also brought up a good segue for me too, Jesse, that I think that part of making process improvement projects work is to have the PI people and the project manager be real strong allies. In addition to doing things like breaking them into chunks and using OCM, the project manager needs to be probably the first person you all co-opt into understanding this is why we do this, this is how we do this. Help us make that work.
Yeah, exactly.
So in your
We
experience, do you think there's a difference between software projects and hardware projects?
Well, first off, Dick, there are lots of differences, absolutely. But if I hear what you're saying in terms of what I just said, about you need the ally and stuff like that and OCM, I don't see a huge difference. But in terms of running the projects, yeah, there's a difference. Gets to be somewhat less and less over time. When I started doing hardware development and software development projects, you know, the often thing said was once you burn metal, it gets real hard to change. But with software, you can change every day. And while that's still true, it's a little less true because you can do some things to simulate hardware and whatnot. But in terms of OCM, making changes to the process, all that sort of stuff, you know, it's still important. I mean, it's still the same largely on both sides. That makes sense? Resonate with you?
One of the, in my opinion, or experience, one of the big deals is software improvement often involves people, because people are the programmers are the people that write the software, where there's less of that on a hardware project.
Yeah, I can agree with that, Dick. Even still, I think that's true. You're dealing with hardware, you're often dealing with more of an internal customer, so to speak. And it's less, what you're making changes to is less visible to the quote unquote regular user. Whereas software, you know, typically is something that a regular user is hit with all the time if you're changing it. So I think I followed what you said and I can agree with that.
moving up the ladder of abstraction, if I may,
Yes.
we've lost some of the big leaders, Deming, Duran, and others. So are there some leaders in OCM that we might be better aware of, that we could consult, etc.?
There's nobody in OCM I'm aware of who's like a Duran or a Deming or anybody like that. That doesn't mean they don't exist. It's just that I'm not aware of them and I'm pretty aware, so I don't think I'm missing anything. The key in terms of OCM will mostly be found in what you're asking, at least, will be mostly found in terms of vendors like ProSci, who is the people who write ADCAR. Sorry, I wish I could tell you that there were more thought leaders that were pretty big hitters, but I don't believe there are. You just have to keep track of what the big vendors are saying.
Great retirement job for you, Tim.
I'll be the guru, the Deming of OCM. That's not a bad idea, actually. Do I owe you a cut now from that, Jesse?
I suppose, yeah.
Okay.
Well, you owe me a cut. Get Jesse out of there. Get your hands off of my stack.
No worries.
Once again, not to put you too much on the spot, but why not? We're having fun, right?
Sure.
Are there any sacred cows that are hard to talk about in process improvement and what you've experienced in OCM?
Not on a universal scale, I think, Gary. I think that there's nothing that's don't touch this third rail because that's a third rail everywhere. Or to put it a different way, there's no Social Security third rail like there is in politics in Washington. When it comes to OCM, I think the kinds of third rails you wouldn't want to touch, the sacred cows that you might not want to touch, are probably more political inside an organization, a specific individual organization. And that I can't answer to because I'm not in every organization. I've not run into anything that I would say is never do this anywhere. And I've done lots of OCM work now, so I'd like to hope that I've hit a pretty good statistical sample. Is there anything specific that you were wondering about in terms of third rails or landmines or whatever you want to call them?
Well, once again, I get mixed up in the metaphors. I don't want to beat a dead horse too much. But software has been having problems for a very, very long time. And many of the leaders, Mary Shaw, David Parnas, Alan Kay, you go down the list, they've made their complaints very vocal, very severe. And the question is, why in software, as I would say, well in process? So I'm from Flint, Michigan, land of good water. And I know about General Motors. My dad worked there. And to me, as a nation, speaking of sacred cows and third rails, there's some things we're not talking about directly and sufficiently. Among them, why do we make the same mistake over and over and over again? I've talked to a lot of people in industry and in areas such as education, and the 1983, A Nation at Risk, etc. So there's kind of a long list of what I call undone work. Not to say too much here. So those are, to me, the sacred cows. We're not really speaking to the long-standing problems that we repeat in industry, and it seems to me we need to do it. We need to talk about it more openly. I'm done.
So I guess my response to that is I don't disagree a bit with what you said. In fact, I'm reading a book by David Halberstam right now about the automotive crisis in the 60s, 70s, and the oil crisis, etc. And he talks a lot about the same kind of thing you just mentioned.
The Reckoning.
The Reckoning, thank you. That's the one. And fundamentally, yeah, those things need to be talked about. I just don't know that really that this presentation focuses on that level of scope. Could it be used that way? Potentially, inside a company or otherwise. But I think what you're talking about is broader than the kind of process improvement that I'm alluding to that I have experience with. Hope that helps.
Understood. Thank you. I appreciate it.
By the way, I'd recommend The Reckoning to anybody. It's an awesome book. And Megan, if you're still here, you're welcome. What else can I answer for anybody?
The question on the Deming for OCM, I've been thinking about that and trying to rack my brain around that. Why there isn't a handful of people that come to mind. And the only thing I can come up with is that it's with quality and Deming and Duran and then there a lot of that focus and a lot of what they preached was tool based. And you know, the process was pretty evident. Everybody kind of agreed with what the process was. Whereas with OCM, there's, like you said, there's many different models out there and it's very much more soft skilled in terms of you got to get people to make this work. And there's really not a good set of tools like there are with implementing quality and measuring quality. Just more abstract, a little bit more abstraction, not abstraction, what's the word I'm looking for?
I think that's a reasonable word. It's not
Yeah,
not statistical in the same way.
yeah,
OCM is a science like sociology is a science. It deals with people.
mhm.
I'll write it down for you, Mike.
Abstract is what I was looking for too. Yeah,
Oh, that's
just
good.
more abstract. Yeah. All right, good.
And I think the other thing I'll say to what you said, Jesse, is that while there are lots of models out there, and I alluded to this before about OCM or for OCM, they all contain the same basic stuff. They're just sliced different ways.
Yeah.
You know, so it may be awareness and desire in the ADKAR model, but maybe the next model combines the two as an example from some other vendor, which
Yeah.
goes to what we're talking about, that it's a very human process rather than statistical process.
Yeah.
I guess I'm hearing that we're coming to an end. Am I right? Or do you have more?
Any more questions out there?
Got any more, Jesse?
I'm good. Just checking in with everybody else.
Next month, I believe our topic is going to be AI impact on software engineering with Megan Graham and Alex Dietz. And see if we can get some discussion on that topic.
That sounds good.
For what it's
So
worth,
I came late. I was
You
busy
broke-
for a new TV.
broke- You broke up, Dick. I can't hear you.
Yeah, so thank you all.
All
Anybody have
right.
any-
thanks everybody. I appreciate
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Well, it was an excellent job, Tim. I really appreciate you, spending time and sharing all this with us. And I hope everybody got a lot out of it. I know I did. And I want to thank you, Tim, for doing such a great job. And anything you want to add before we close out, Dick? Anybody else? All right, we all have a good rest of your night.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Jesse.